This is the Graceful Atheist podcast. Welcome. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. This is the first in a series called A Believer Interviews the Graceful Atheist. In these episodes, I will have believers who I've gotten to know and who I've grown trust with. I'll allow them to interview me and ask me the difficult and hopefully genuine questions. Rather than just trying to argue with them, I'll see if I can get them to understand why I no longer believe. The idea is to reverse the roles and have the believer in the skeptic seat asking the hard questions. And to return to a common theme for the podcast, instead of having merely an intellectual debate, let's have an honesty contest. Then, if and only if the person is interested, they can come back for a second episode where I might ask them some tougher questions about their faith. If you are a believer and you have hard questions for me, and you'd like to ask those on the podcast, get in touch at gracefulatheist@gmail.com or at gracefulatheist on Twitter. Criticisms from both the religious and the secular perspectives are welcome. My requirement for guests with criticisms for me is that they meet me on the same level of self-honesty. Again, rather than merely having an intellectual debate, let's have an honesty contest. As deconverts, we may find ourselves in the odd position of defending our former faith, when believers want to say that we must never have been true Christians, or that our faith must not have been real. Today's episode was prompted by a discussion on Twitter on this very topic. I'll have the link to the Twitter conversation in the show notes. JC Murphy on Twitter, one of the creative minds behind the XVs in Paradise Twitter account, he made the following statement, which I retweeted. Inherent in true believers keep believing is, I'm a true believer, but you weren't because you stopped believing. Problem is, there's still time. You can never really know if you're a true believer, real Christian, etc. It's a useless designation and claims. And then, an interesting thing happened. Reverend David Hellsten, a Baptist pastor from Milford, England, responded, "This is one of the many reasons why I reject Calvinism, and its once saved, always saved idea. I know too many non-believers who were once genuine Christians. If they were mistaken, how do I know I'm not as well?" I thought this was such a really wonderful response, and began to have a conversation with David. And I asked him, as a pastor, what he thought were the reasons that people deconvert and walk away from faith. Now, his immediate responses were maybe what you would expect. Disillusionment, they've been hurt by the church, things of that nature. So I asked him, would you believe me if I told you that for myself and the many, many deconverts I've talked to over the last few years, very few would say the reasons that you mentioned were what led us to deconvert? And this is his response, and I quote, "Well, I have no reason to disbelieve you, and I'd be very interested to hear what your real reasons were." Now, that response just blew me away. It was quite honest and forthright, and it showed a willingness to have a conversation. So I invited David onto the podcast. What may not be immediately clear is what kind of risk that both David and I were taking. We had literally just met each other, on Twitter no doubt. But this turned out to be an amazing conversation and a true honesty contest. This episode is successful because of David's honesty and his forthrightness and his willingness to actually hear. It was so successful that we are planning at least one more episode together, if not more. I do ask David a series of questions in the beginning just to get a feel for his background and faith tradition, and then I hand the mic over to him to ask the questions. You might notice that we occasionally cut each other off, but I assure you that that was from excitement about the conversation rather than animosity. Again, I apologize for the audio quality on my mic. This is the last episode before I got a real podcaster's mic. And now I'm very excited to share with you Reverend David Hellsten interviews me, the Graceful Atheist. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I think we're going to do something quite interesting. We're going to have you, we're going to turn the roles around here and have you interview me, ask me some of the hard questions. Mm-hmm. But before we jump into that, I want you to tell the listeners who you are, what work you do, anything about your ministry that you think people should know.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say this is a first for me. I've never been on a podcast before. And having said that, everybody's now worked out that I'm not originally a native English speaker. My name is David, and I'm Swedish originally, but I now live and work in England because my wife is English. So very simple explanation there.
Mm-hmm.
And I am a minister in a small Baptist church on the south coast of England, which means I get to do a lot of things that the super pastors in the big churches don't have to do, like put the rubbish out on Wednesday nights and that sort of
yes.
thing. And, well, in a way, I don't know what else to say. I mean, my wife's English, so I'm obviously married.
Mm-hmm.
2 kids, a daughter who's 19, and my son who is 16, will be 17 soon.
I'll tell you what,
met my wife in Albania. We were missionaries in Albania, so we met out there and moved to England when her father died and her mother needed us closer, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, what else do you want me to say about my ministry? It's kind of fairly standard. We had a funeral last week, have a baptism this coming week, occasional weddings, but this is a retirement area, so we have fewer of those than we have funerals.
Okay. Interesting. But basically, pastoral work is
Yes.
what you do. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But you were a missionary at one point in time, and now you're
which of course involved both preaching and teaching believers, but also trying to explain to non-believers what Christianity is all about. And Albania is obviously very different, both from England and from America. So
right.
quite a challenge.
Yeah, interesting. Just for a second, let's touch on. I always find it interesting that in the United States we have no official religion, and yet we are fairly heavily influenced religiously. And in the UK, there is an official church, the Anglican Church. And my question to you is, do you feel like that strengthens believers? And let me say one more thing, that the UK tends to be slightly more secular than the US. Do you think that helps believers in the UK, or do you think to be closer knit?
Yes, I think, especially now, because I was looking at this for another reason not long ago, and we've got about 5,000 residents in this village on the south coast here. And there's 4 churches. It's us, the Anglican Church, a small Methodist church, and the Catholic Church. And on a very good Sunday, we might have 250 people between the 4 of us. That's about 5% of the population of our village.
Okay.
And it's a retirement village, and old people are supposed to be more religious than the younger people. So you can imagine that the percentage is even lower in other parts of the country.
Okay.
And I do think that in that situation, a lot of the sort of denominational barriers and the prejudices that you've mentioned on your blog as well, kind of, don't listen to them, I'm right. If my version of Christianity is correct. Well, I'm not like the other 99% because I believe that I am like the other 99%. And we do work together a lot in the village. And I think that is a common pattern all over the UK and in Sweden, where even fewer would go to church on a normal Sunday. So I think in a way it helps. It helps us focus on the essentials and kind of realize that the things that distinguish us from the Anglicans, they're not kind of the main thing. Whereas I've never been to the States. I worked with a number of American missionaries in Albania, but obviously anything I say about America has to be taken with a few pinches of salt, because I've probably misunderstood something somewhere. But I do get the impression that churches are much more, I don't know, not segregated, but kind of denominational, and people tend to be, I'm a Baptist, so I don't know anything about Presbyterians. Oh, I'm a Methodist, so I don't know anything about the Episcopalians. And we can't afford to be like that in the UK, basically. We have to work together.
Right.
We have to focus on what matters rather than all the paraphernalia.
I think that's a fair assessment. One of the interesting things in the US is that you can literally pass 5 or 6 churches to go to the church of your choice, right?
Yeah.
In any square mile, there might be multiple churches.
Yeah, it's a situation that we find very difficult to imagine over here.
Yes. Right. Well, David, thank you for joining me today, and I appreciate that this might be a new experience. It's kind of new for me on the podcast as well, but I think it's going to make for some interesting conversation.
I hope so. That's why I'm here.
one of the main drivers for the Graceful Atheist podcast is to interview people who have deconverted. And very, very quickly, I want to make sure that we're using the same definition for that. By that, I mean people who have had a real faith in a supernatural religion, typically just because of my experience of Christianity, but any religion, and who have subsequently lost their belief in God or any gods for that matter. And when I interview people, I am definitely a sympathetic ear, right? I'm saying yes, definitely, and I recognize that when I have been interviewed by other deconverts or ex-Christians or whatever term you'd like to use, they're also a sympathetic ear. And so what I think might be interesting is that you're going to have some natural skepticism about my story, and that's good. So in an interesting role reversal, you're in some ways
supposed to be the skeptic.
Yes, you're going to be the skeptic today. And I hope that makes things interesting. We met on Twitter very, very recently, so we are perfect strangers.
I've been following you for a while. I can't remember when I first followed you, but because I kind of see Twitter as a place where I can interact with people that don't agree with me.
Right.
And I find more of those kind of on Twitter and online than I do in my church. Surprise, surprise.
Right. Right. And I think that's incredibly healthy. And one of the reasons I asked you on is your response to a conversation we were having on Twitter. And that was about an experience that's pretty common for us who have deconverted, of having our previous faith called into question. So we often hear, well, you must not have been a real Christian. And it's interesting because that then places those of us who have deconverted in the position of trying to defend our former faith, which is just completely backwards.
That's a good point, actually. I hadn't thought of that.
It's an interesting place. So anyway,
I was a true believer.
Exactly, yeah. Anyway, I thought your responses to that conversation were thoughtful, and that's why I've invited you on.
Because I've debated that with people, with other Christians who have made a sort of comment,
right?
Especially Calvinists, as I mentioned, because they have this once saved, always saved,
right?
Which, by the way, very few Baptists in the UK would subscribe to. You come across it, but most Baptists in the UK are not Calvinists. They don't believe in predestination and therefore don't believe in once saved, always saved. Oh, and we're also not dispensationalists generally.
Okay.
They're saying Baptist can conjure up the wrong images for Americans because you tend to think of Southern Baptists, and we are
right. Yeah, definitely.
We're quite different to Southern Baptists in many aspects. Sometimes it's only believers Baptists and that we have in common with them.
Interesting.
We have Northern Baptists, maybe we're more similar to them. I don't know.
But anyway, that was not my denomination, so I actually don't want to speak in ignorance. And,
So I've already interacted with that. Because my sister and I grew up together, became Christians as teenagers, I guess, when my dad became a Christian. When we were born, my dad was an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom is still an atheist. My dad became a Christian in his 30s after a rather nasty divorce. And he kind of had a sort of crisis and started praying, even though he didn't believe in God, but God answered him anyway. So there we are. So me and my sister, kind of from, I don't know, well, I guess I was 7 or 8 when my dad became a Christian. So kind of that's when faith came into the household. I became a Christian in my own right, if you like, as a teenager.
Okay.
My sister had a similar path. But then when she was around 19, 20, 21, she started gradually slipping away and is now very negative, very anti-anything faith.
Okay.
And because I have that experience within my own family, as far as I can tell, when she was 15, 16, 17, she was a genuine believer.
Right.
So I've never accepted that argument, which is why I responded to your tweet. And I say, I'm a pastor, but I agree with you on this. You can't say, we can't come at you and say, oh, you probably weren't a Christian in the first place. I take issue with that. So that's how this whole conversation started.
Exactly.
For the benefit of our listeners, that's where we came in. We started off by agreeing on something.
That's right. Yeah. So fantastic. I think that's great. And you've kind of answered one of my first really quick question. I wanted to ask just very quickly a handful of questions just to orient us around your beliefs, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to you. So, so you mentioned that you basically became a Christian at around the age of 7.
I had my Christianity came into the family when I was about 7, when my dad became a Christian. I had some sort of spiritual experience around that age, which I cannot remember anymore. But both my dad and myself, we remember me talking about it when I was that age. Mm-hmm. So I had some sort of experience, which I must have described to him, but I can't remember what it was.
Right.
But I had a second, not really conversion experience, because I had the sort of nominal belief anyway, but a personal experience of God, I would call it, when I was 14.
Okay.
Yeah, nearly 15, which kind of made me. We have a good expression in Swedish. We say a personal Christian.
Okay.
As opposed to kind of when it means something to you personally, and it's not based anymore on whether your parents believe or the youth group you go to. When it's kind of internalized faith, maybe I guess we could call it. And that was when I was 14, nearly 15.
Right. You're past the age of reason, and you're making a volitional choice at that point.
Yeah.
Or
even though it was based on an experiential.
Right.
Experiential experience. Can you say that?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
A spiritual experience of some sort.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm.
So very quickly, for your understanding of God, would you say that God is all powerful, all knowing, yes, all loving, and personal?
Yes.
Okay. And so you've already described that you made a personal decision. Would you describe in the States, particularly in the Baptist or evangelical traditions, we talk about having a personal relationship with Jesus? Is that a way you would describe it?
Yeah, I tend to not avoid that phrase, but kind of, if I use that phrase, I try to explain it in other words as well. Just like I try not to kind of talk too glibly about being saved or kind of salvation, because especially in our context here, those religious words are not necessarily understood the way I want them to be understood. And if you can't say it in a language that an outsider can understand, then you're not going to be able to communicate with the outsiders.
Right.
So, but I mean, yes, I would go along with that. That experience started my personal relationship with God. But I wouldn't necessarily use that term with people who don't have that experience or can relate to it.
Understood. Okay. So that does help me, though, get a sense of where you're at. Do you believe the Bible is, and you can pick any of these, inerrant, authoritative, inspired, historically accurate, or spiritual stories?
Again, I'm a bit wary of the terms inerrant and infallible, because people seem to mean different things. I would definitely inspired. God is behind it, I would say, yes. Mm-hmm. I would say it is probably, I'm trying to think how to put this. I would probably subscribe to the general definition of inerrancy, mm-hmm, if I have understood it right. But I wouldn't be terribly upset, and it wouldn't shake my faith if I discovered that actually they got some figures wrong, or they got the dates wrong, or they did misspell this name, or kind of they confused which pharaoh was which. It wouldn't shake me too much. So I guess I'm a loose inerrantist.
Okay.
You see what I mean? The main thing is that Jesus. It isn't. The Bible doesn't have to be totally flawless, but so far I still feel sufficiently convinced of its truthfulness to take it as reliable as written, shall we say?
Fair enough. Yeah,
that was a complicated answer. Sorry about that.
No, actually, it's an honest one. I appreciate that. That's fantastic. A couple more, just very, very quick but hard questions. For those people who are aware of the gospel of Christ but who do not accept it, do they go to hell? And is hell a real place? Is it eternal torture? Is it the absence of God, or is it annihilation?
But it's definitely the absence of God. And in a way, that is the best. In a way, that's probably the best way of putting it, because to me as a Christian, the absolute total absence of God is about the most terrifying thought I can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously to an atheist, it doesn't convey that horror, which means I think you and I can probably quite happily agree that, yeah, hell, saying that if there is an afterlife, that those who haven't believed in God will end up spending the afterlife without God. It doesn't sound terrifying to you, but it does to me. Apart from that,
I understand, and again, because I came from a faith, I understand, and I would have described it as the absence of God.
Yeah.
Then also, I think.
I believe in hell in the sense that I don't believe that everybody goes to heaven. But every time I teach about this, every time we discuss this in a Bible study where I preach about it, I always say, I really wish that I could say I believe everybody goes to heaven. I really wish that was the case. And if when we get to heaven, it turns out that we misunderstood it, and actually everybody is saved through the blood of Jesus, whether they wanted to or not, I'll be over the moon. I don't understand, and I've discussed this with Christians on Twitter as well. I really don't understand these people who seem to take sort of gleeful, I don't know, haha, you're going to burn in hell.
Right.
I don't get that. I mean, every Christian should wish for everybody to avoid hell. And the whole point of the good news, in a way, is that you don't have to spend eternity without God. That's part of the good news. So what I've said in various contexts is anyone who wants to be with Jesus will be with Jesus. I go along. Have you read C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce? Are you familiar with
C.S. Lewis? I've read a few of his. I'm not sure I've read that particular one. So.
Because that one, The Great Divorce, is basically about the afterlife. And I mean, he says very clearly, this is an attempt at imagining or kind of describing the principles behind it. But it's basically a bunch of people who have been condemned, if you like, going on a sort of day trip to the outskirts of heaven, and they meet a loved one who has gone before them to heaven, who tries to make them understand how it works, I want to say. And they're also turned in on themselves, that they cannot desire something outside of themselves. They're so turned in on what they want, what they've done, who they were. They can't look beyond themselves and desire God. Which is why the main point of that book is, in the end, there's only two kinds of people. The ones who say to God, your will be done. And the ones to whom God says, well, let it be done to you as you wish.
Right.
So hell is basically God abandoning people to their own internal impulses and lusts and things. It's not kind of a sadistic punishment. It will, in a way, it is punishment for not accepting God's good offer, but it isn't the caricature. I quite like that, because I would love for everybody to be saved, but I can't find any reassurance in the Bible that that would be the case. And if people have rejected Jesus in this life, why would they want him in the next? But I would be very happy to get to heaven and find that I was wrong.
Fair enough. And again, I think I would have been very, very close to your description of that when I was a believer.
Yeah, okay.
I think
it wasn't the kind of fire. It wasn't the fire and brimstone, and
that was not my particular brand. No. So,
okay. Because you do come across. I mean, Westboro Baptist is the worst example of them all. It's kind of only our church is going to heaven, and I'm not even sure about half of our members, sort of thing. How do you live with that, and how do you work? I don't get that.
It's not a lot of good news in there. Yeah.
It's going to have to implode and just. I mean, yeah. Anyway, let's not talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. So
they're making their own hell for themselves, I think.
Last question, and then I'm just going to let you start asking your questions. But what prompted this was, I asked you the question. What is your opinion on why some believers deconvert? And so I'd like you just to share for a moment what you think are some of those reasons, and then hopefully we'll get to what mine were, and maybe some of the people.
Yeah, well, in a way, that is a kind of nice segue into me asking you, because you invited me onto this podcast because you asked me that question on Twitter. And what is my opinion of what causes people to deconvert? I gave you the 3 reasons that I thought were the most common. I mean, it was a bit off the cuff. I hadn't prepared it as an answer, obviously. Yeah. And some of them were based on some people I do know. And your answer to me, quoting from your tweet here, would you believe me if I told you that for myself and the many, many deconverts I've talked to over the last few years, very few would say the reasons you mentioned are what led us to deconvert. And that kind of triggered my curiosity. Kind of, oh, okay. Those are what I thought were the most common causes. If they're not the common causes, well, what is? Which is what I replied to you then. So I don't know if there's any point in me reiterating my 3 mistaken reasons. I'd like to talk about them, kind of see why you say that they're mistaken. But maybe.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying that no one, deconverts for those reasons. And I think we talked about, disillusionment with the church, being, I don't have the tweet in front of me. If you do, you can.
I do. Yeah. Shall I read my response to you there?
Yes, please. Yeah.
My reply was, sadly, it's often disillusionment with the church rather than with God. Sometimes it is obviously rebellion, i.e. wanting to lead a lifestyle that the church, stroke the Bible, stroke their tradition doesn't approve of. And sometimes I think it really is because they never actually believed. And I'm thinking the middle one there, wanting to lead a lifestyle that the Bible doesn't approve of. I brought that in because I did once know a pastor. We trained for a while at the same Bible college in Sweden, even though he was actually English. He was married to a Swedish woman, kind of the opposite of me. Mm-hmm. And then some years ago, I heard that he'd left his wife, gone off with another woman, moved abroad, given up on faith, given up on everything. And both my understanding and his ex-wife's understanding was that he left church and faith because he wanted to go off with this other woman, and that wasn't compatible with the biblical faith. So that is why I put that in. That's one of the. I know of one case where there was the actual reason. Well, as far as we can tell, that was the reason.
Yeah.
Obviously, it could have started the other way around, but that's not how his wife understood it. Yes. She would have been fairly close to the situation for a while, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those were my 3 reasons, and then you said that for most people it's not any of those. So then, I was curious. And my first question to you was going to be, so how would you describe the reasons that you deconverted?
Yeah. So, I could spend 2-3 hours, trying to answer that question, but the most succinct way to say it, and there's not a nice way to say this, so forgive me ahead of time, is that the vast majority of people that I've talked to and my experience personally is that there's a period of time in which we are struggling to hold on to belief in the face of either evidence or life experiences that show us otherwise. And ultimately, we come to the conclusion that the claims of Christianity are factually untrue. Now, again, that's a succinct way to say it, and it's a whole lot more than that. But that is the seed truth that I think is interesting to try to convey.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you've been taught something, and then, as you said, life experience or your logical thinking or facts, whatever that come against you, seem to indicate that what you were taught was wrong, well, then obviously you should analyze it and follow the evidence. I mean, again, I'm all for following the evidence. I'm passionate about the truth.
Me too.
And I'm sure that is something that we share. And I mean, a lot of atheists are as well. And sadly, there seem to be Christians who are not. I've come across the hashtag lying for Jesus on Twitter, especially kind of obviously from atheists. The friendly atheist, Hammond, how do you pronounce his name? Hammond? Meta?
Yeah, Meta, yeah.
Meta, yeah, the friendly. I mean, he's retweeted things with the hashtag lying for Jesus, and I just think, why do people do that? If Jesus is who he says he is, if Christianity is true, the last thing we want to do is lie about it. Why would you do that? I mean, somebody who lies about, well, whatever, about the gospel or a miracle or anything, I mean, they're just showing that they obviously don't have enough solid evidence. So all you're doing is giving fuel for the atheist fire.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm passionate about truth, and the reason I'm a Christian today is that I'm still convinced that that is the truth. It fits the facts better than the alternative. But obviously, should I be so overwhelmed by evidence to the contrary, including then evidence that would suggest that my evidence in favor is mistaken, well, I mean, I would have to change my mind, obviously.
Right.
And I don't understand these Christians who say, oh no, I'm always going to be Christian, even if they dug up Jesus' dead body and kind of found a signed paper from Peter and the others saying that we all agree to lie about it. I would still be Christian. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me either.
Right. So a couple of things I want to respond to, like, you're describing a passion for the truth, and part of my goal here, and I think this is actually potentially beneficial for you as a pastor, right? There might be people who are experiencing doubts in your church, or some of the people that you pastor to.
I mean, I've had doubts as well. I mean, I've had times when I've kind of never come close to deconverting, obviously, but I've kind of had thoughts, what if they're right? What if that is actually a stronger argument? What if my experience as a teenager and what about subsequent spiritual experience were just psychological events, chemical things in my brain, and nothing to do with any supernatural reality whatsoever? I mean, thoughts like that have crossed my mind, and there have been times when they were quite persistent, but they've never been able to overcome the evidence on the other side, as it were. So that is another question I was going to kind of bring to you, but I can't remember now. Are you in the middle of answering another question?
I could go on, but I'd rather go with your questions. Go ahead.
Because the question that, well, one of many questions obviously was, there were kind of, if I understand you right, you felt the evidence piled up against Christianity, and kind of non-faith, if you like, made more sense eventually than faith. Was it ever during that period, I don't know how long that went on for, if you're talking about weeks or months or years, but was there ever anything happening during that time that tried to pull you in the other direction? Did you have any kind of experience or thoughts or books? I mean, like a lot of atheists, you don't seem to think very highly of Lee Strobel's Case for Christ and similar things.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, was there nothing once that process had started, if you like, was it all kind of thing after thing after thing piling up against Christianity and nothing counteracting it? Or was it sort of a tug of war, if you like, between the pros and cons?
Right. So let me try to, I think there's a few questions in there. Let me try to answer.
Yeah, might well be.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes from a guy named Bart Campolo, who is the son of Tony Campolo, who was a very famous evangelist. Someone asked him, when did you start to have doubts? And he said something to the effect of, about 15 minutes after I became a Christian. So there's this tension of, on the one hand, I was all in. I was an evangelistic Christian. I would tell people about Jesus. I read my Bible. I prayed. I was 100% in. And on the flip side of that, there was always a part in the back of my head that and this is hindsight. So I'll admit that maybe this is hindsight, but in hindsight, that was always saying, yeah, but maybe not. But is there really, evidence for that? And so as an adult, I had a number of, I was, going to church. but I had a number of friends who were either, just kind of blasé secular, not necessarily atheists, and a few firebrand atheists. And I thought, we're of the same kind of cultural, socioeconomic experience. Why do I have faith and you don't? And I would spend hours thinking about this. What is it? Because I was like you, David, I was fully convinced. And in particular for me, the resurrection was everything, right? If Jesus,
I would agree with that.
I will grant you this. If Jesus literally died, was dead for 3 days, and literally rose from the grave and ascended into heaven, then I should be a Christian.
Well, yeah, so you should.
Yes, exactly. And I would be if I had evidence that was of the same standard I would use for any other religion or historical claim. And what I came to over time, and again, this was a process. It wasn't overnight. Was that I was all of the things I was convinced about, say Lee Strobel's book or others, talk about the historical evidence for Christ, was that what the Bible seems to prove is that a group of people believed Jesus rose from the dead, and
yeah, well, that's fairly standard. Kind of, they obviously believed it, whether it was
so I 100% believe that they believed that. What is the huge leap, and you need to understand that I came to this from the other side, from your side of the fence.
Yeah.
So this isn't me being a obstinate, stubborn atheist. This was me being a careful, hopefully I wanted to be thoughtful believer, and kind of realizing, the jump from there was a person named Jesus who had had wonderful moral and teachings that I still admire today, and who may have in fact been crucified, and who had a following of people who were devastated afterwards, and an entire cultural revolution took place because of that. I'm fine accepting that. What is the next leap is saying that he is the Son of the living God, God incarnate on earth, that he literally died, that he literally rose from the dead, that he's literally in a place called heaven today at the right hand of his Father. That's a huge, huge leap. And any other historical document that we have, when they make even mediocre supernatural claims, we don't accept those at face value. And so when I started to ask myself, why is it that I understood early on that my entire faith hinged on the resurrection, but I began to ask myself, why do I believe that the resurrection took place? Now, I had faith, I had a subjective experience, I had a sense of God's presence. Those are the reasons why I accepted that to begin with. But when I tried to ask myself, do I have an objective reason, a reason outside of myself that a skeptic might believe? So these friends of mine, right? What piece of evidence could I explain to them? And I thought, surely there's just mountains of evidence somewhere. And I started to go look for it. And the more I read from apologetics and the arguments, the case for Christ concept, right, just laying that out, the more I realized that even as a believer, I did not accept those arguments.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Rather worrying as well. I mean, if Lee Strobel doesn't even manage to convince somebody who is a believer at the time,
right,
we'll be sort of convincing anybody who comes at it at a more skeptical angle. Yeah. That's very interesting, because I know I've seen other atheists also kind of dissing Lee Strobel's books. I mean, I've only read The Case for Christ, which seems to be sort of the first one, and I'm not really happy with the kind of him churning out case after case now, sort of the case for this and the case for that. It does seem like it's become sort of a money-making machine than genuine apologetics, and I'm no happier about that than you are.
Right.
But I did think, when I read The Case for Christ, I found it quite persuasive. But obviously, because I already agreed with, I mean, for one thing, I'd already studied a lot of that, having been to Bible college and things.
Right.
And
so have I. That's something that hasn't come up yet. But yes, I went to Bible college. I have a degree in church leadership. I particularly focused on theology, philosophy, church history, that kind of thing.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. We only met on Twitter. We don't really know anything. I don't even know if you're married.
Yes, I am married, and I've got two daughters. And again, my family are believers. So one of the interesting things about, and I think the great irony is that I still have a pastoral sense, a feeling of, here we have all the Pew Research talking about the people who are non-religious, again, whatever term you choose for them.
Yeah.
And that's exploding. And I see this online, and I think, we have this huge group of people who are alienated and on their own, and not everyone can go out and do that on their own. We need to build community. So part of my goal, and I can see that this might be antithetical to what you would want, but is to provide some level of community, to provide a way for people to tell their stories and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a human need.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like they started this, I haven't read much about it recently, but some years ago, they started this, what was it called? The Sunday Assembly, which is basically a church for atheists.
Right.
And kind of everything, kind of communal singing, testimonies, somebody sharing a thought for the day.
Yeah.
Just like a church service, just without God.
Right.
Because and the thing is, in a way, it's just kind of funny. And in a way, kind of think, yeah, so that is a human need. So how many of the people that come to my church, and we only have about 45 people on a Sunday, so it's very small. I mean, minute by American standards, but kind of sort of small average in England. How many of them come more because they like the fellowship and the friendship, and less because they actually want to worship God? And I mean, obviously, in a small church like that, I know everybody in the church. Obviously, we've kind of got 70 people in the address book. That's kind of people who are on the fringe as well as the regular worshippers. And it's not that difficult to know each one of them a little bit at least. And but I mean, I know that there are some that are not committed Christians, and they probably come then because they like the fellowship, or they kind of like, there's a lot of vaguely religious, and found that, well, this suits them, which kind of makes the life of a pastor quite interesting, because you kind of think, so how do I deal with this? Should I sort of get them to either make a decision for Jesus, or, well, actually, if you don't want to follow Jesus, you shouldn't really be coming to church? Or that seems a bit harsh. So, I mean, I'm quite happy to have them come. If they want to come and kind of sit through an hour and a bit of worship and preaching on a Sunday because they like the fellowship, well, then so be it. I'm not going to deprive them of that friendship, even if they come for what I theologically might want to call the wrong reasons.
Right.
And I reckon there are pastors that will take very different views on that, especially if you have hundreds of worshippers anyway. You can afford to get rid of the ones that aren't there for the right reasons. I'd rather include as many as possible.
Absolutely. And I want to just respond a little bit and to say you've hit the nail on the head, that the community is a human need. And so if you've read some of my blog, I often say that just because we deconverts have walked away from religion doesn't mean that we don't need to belong, to have a sense of connection with other human beings. And if you want some pastoral advice from an atheist, it would be, community is the thing that the church does the best, right? Like what you are winning with is providing a reason for people to come together and to connect with one another. And my argument as a secular humanist is that you are meeting a very human need. that need to belong, that need to connect, that need to be confessional with one another, to love each other, to hold each other up when you're sick, to, all of those things you are meeting human needs. And to that extent, I am very happy that you do the work that you do, even though we disagree on the fundamental reasons for why you do it. I think that it's meeting a human need.
Yeah. Okay. Should we go back to some of the questions I'd
Sure.
thought of? We don't have to go through all of them, obviously, and there's not that many, but kind of thinking about this, I've been running it through my head over the last couple of days. And there was one I thought, what's the most stupid thing that you've heard a Christian say to you in order to try and win you back?
Boy, that's it's a great question. I feel like I'm not going to have a great answer. Because all of my responses are kind of typical atheist responses. So but
what's the most stupid thing the Christians have said?
Yeah, so
there must have been some.
Let me just say in general, right? Quoting the Bible, in particular, maybe a reference to hell for unbelievers, or for the foolishness of the atheist, or pick your verse, whichever one it is.
Yeah.
To an atheist, the Bible is a claim. In other words, there are two claims now. The claim is that God exists, and the secondary claim is that the Bible is in somehow a direct communication from God. And so if a believer, if a Christian says to me, it quotes to me a verse about, again, anything about my lack of belief sending me to hell or what have you, it is, I can't describe to you what it feels like. It feels like, I try to be nice to people. I try, but it's ridiculous is what it is, right?
Yeah.
I have no response, because the Bible, which I find to be a beautiful piece of literature, I think it describes beautifully a group of people in a particular time, in a particular culture, experiencing what they felt was God and trying to describe that. So I'm not banging on the Bible. What I'm arguing is that the supernatural claims of the Bible is the point of contention that I have. And so therefore, when someone, quotes that to me in order to either scare me or to push me back into the kingdom, as it were, I find that a silly exercise.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Again, it's one of these things. I see it on Twitter, or you see it sometimes on in real life as well. Kind of, if I just quote the Bible enough to you, you'll be convicted and overcome by remorse.
Right.
And I've always kind of thought, no, I don't think it's going to work. This guy's an atheist. He doesn't believe in the Bible. Therefore, telling him what the Bible says isn't going to make any difference. It's like I'm not going to make anybody communist by going and reading Das Kapital to them either. They have to be convinced by the basic premises before the literature is going to make an impact on them.
Right.
So that's
one more thing about that, if I may, and that is that not all atheists are former believers, but those of us who, and that's why I use the word deconversion to be very, very specific. But those of us who were, not all, but many of us were in ministry, like myself, went to Bible college. So we understand exegesis, hermeneutics, we've read the Bible from cover to cover multiple times.
That's something that has made an impression on me, actually. And a lot of the kind of, I don't know what to call them, not the radical atheists, but the activist atheists, the ones that are actively arguing for their faith, I was going to say, the activists trying to deconvert others, if you like.
Sure.
They often know the Bible better than a lot of Christians. And that is, again, it's impressive. And it's rather sad for me as a pastor, because obviously I wish that the people who actually follow Jesus would bother reading both what he said and what others said about him, and what led up to him coming into the world, the Old Testament, and I think, again, I could be wrong, but I do get the impression that in America, because Christianity is so much more culturally ingrained, I want to say, acceptable, kind of people kind of quite easily go to church, sing the songs, believe that Jesus died for their sins and rose again because that's what they told the church. But it never goes beyond that. It's still not something they do actively, as it were. They don't read the Bible. They don't it doesn't mean much outside of church. Now, we do have that sort of believer in this country as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think because of the secularization process, most of them have been weeded out, if you like. So you don't get anywhere near as many cultural Christians here as I believe you do in the States. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong, because most of what I know about the States is based on meeting Americans abroad or Twitter or American movies, which are probably not representative in any way. I mean, I don't know about American movies because there are hardly ever any actual Christians, especially evangelicals, in American movies. But then when you read about America outside of the movies, America is full of, well, people that I would call evangelicals in inverted commas. That's another word that means something very different on this side of the Atlantic. Well, there we are. So
yeah, so
I think that was a long deviation on the whole thing, that a lot of atheists seem to have read the Bible and kind of may not have grasped all of it in the way that I wish they would, but they seem to have grasped a lot more of it than a lot of ordinary Christians have. And that's, I have to hand that to you. You've done your homework in a way that a lot of Christians haven't.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to change your mind. I think if I could convince you to believe me when I say that I was a believer, and that I believe that. And that I believed that the Bible was true, that it was, I was never really a strong inerrantist. I was probably closer to what you've described, but definitely inspired, definitely in authoritative. And, read it multiple times as a believer with faith. And then near the end, read it again with, as doubts started to creep in. And I find that, and again, I don't want to make too many generalizations here, but I find that a number of the people who I talk to who are deconverts are from that strain. They were deeply held beliefs in their past, and subsequently the doubts overwhelm them. Now, just one more thing though, you mentioned kind of cultural Christians. We I don't want to get into politics, but you'll notice that our Pew Research and various other surveys that are out there are struggling to try to define what does it mean when someone says they are evangelical, right? If they use that term, if you then go on to ask them, do you believe in the incarnate Christ or the inerrancy of Scripture, what have you? Any number of faith statements that changes who is and who isn't.
I've seen some of the research as well. I mean, some of it's just ridiculous. Some of it, but it's and of course, evangelical in the States has now come to mean kind of Trump supporter, kind of the far right, or at least the right. And again, to me, on this side of the pond, I find that very strange. We kind of, I wouldn't in America. To your American audience, I would not use the term evangelical about where I stand, because it has such political overtones in America.
Right.
Whereas here, I would, because here it's purely a statement about what I believe about the Bible. And evangelicals in Europe tend to be not necessarily on the left side of things. It's kind of more of a spectrum, but evangelicals in Europe tend to be much more pro, let's call it social justice, because I can't think of another term, kind of very much for helping refugees, for debt relief, and kind of there's none of this, the poor only have themselves to blame and that sort of thing. But now we're going into politics, and that's not the purpose of this discussion either. But it's just one of these kind of why discussions can go wrong and conversations can go wrong, because we use terms we think we agree on what they mean.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why, as I said, I tend to try and use synonyms not just say Christian, but kind of say Christian, a disciple, follower of Jesus, and kind of try to mix the words that I use to describe that particular reality, or kind of, because otherwise it becomes a jargon and you don't even know if people have understood what you're talking about. And I kind of, obviously as a preacher, I want people to understand what I'm talking about.
Right. Clarity.
It kind of makes sense. I mean, what's the point of standing and sermonizing if nobody's actually gaining anything from it?
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
There we are. I was going to share one. Somebody in our congregation some years ago, we were having some Bible study, and I don't know if we were talking about kind of why people don't believe, or kind of how to explain faith to people outside or something like that. And this guy, old man, said, well, if people only realized that there are more resurrections in the Bible than just Jesus, they would find it easy to believe. And I thought, what? What planet are you living on?
Yeah.
I mean, people struggle enough with the resurrection of Jesus. If you then kind of talk about other resurrection, Jesus raising other people to life, that's not going to make it easier for anybody who's already doubting to believe. If anything, it's going to make them, I don't know, we didn't pursue that. It's just one of these things that made me think that I'm quite glad that he wasn't out there trying to reconvert somebody, because I think he would just have been laughed at. And it's that sort of thing that kind of made me wonder. I mean, one thing, again, one of these things where I would probably side with you against somebody in my own camp is when Christians say, well, deep down, all atheists do acknowledge God's existence because it says so in Romans 1. Have you come across that?
Oh, yes.
Did you even use it before you deconverted?
I'm not sure that I used it. I was big on grace. My thing was,
well, yeah.
Whenever I encountered atheists as a believer, my opinion was that they had just never heard the good news as good news. And so I was always focused on, but you need to hear about the grace part.
Yeah, but I mean, that's very close to my heart, because I could feel the same. I mean, that's one reason why it's good to have this conversation, because obviously you have heard the good news. You're obviously from, I don't know what denomination you come from originally, but it's obviously not one of the more extreme, graceless ones that you come across.
It was, but I just wasn't.
Well, okay, fair enough.
I actually came from originally the Assemblies of God, so there was definitely some fire and brimstone there. And
yes, could have been.
I always felt a little bit like an outsider because my focus was on grace, and I learned that in Bible college. So I always say that my heart was won by the Jesus of the Gospels, and my mind was won by systematic theology and the Pauline epistles, right? And so,
you really do sound very much like me. It's not just our names that we have in common. Yeah, it's interesting. What was the reaction from your family and friends when you deconverted? Because obviously it is a bigger thing in the States than it would be here, because I'm in here.
Yeah.
The majority of people are non-Christians anyway, for all intents and purposes.
That is a great question. And the hardest person to tell, then the first person that I told was my wife. So my wife is very much a believer. Part of my reason.
That must be tricky. That must be hard.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
In some ways. Yeah.
Part of my reason for using the pseudonym is to protect her, right? She hasn't signed up for this. I find selfishly that I need this outlet. She is aware of it. I don't hide it.
Yeah, I was going to say, surely she knows about it.
So, she definitely knows I'm completely out front with that, but I don't try to, I don't do public Facebook posts, and rubber nose in it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah.
But she has been amazing because, and I'll be the first person to acknowledge that I was, sticking a knife into her heart, right? I was the tacit, implicit promise that we made one another was, predicated upon faith. And so as I told her that I was having very strong doubts, and as I got bolder to tell her, I no longer believe, I took it upon myself to make sure that I expressed to her how much I loved her, that our relationship was built on more than just our shared religious experience, but that I volitionally choose to love her, that I, everything about her, and to, in other words, I understood that I was the one hurting her, and that I didn't get to be picky about how things went down. She was wonderful. I think she was deeply hurt. I think she's still deeply hurt, and occasionally I try to bring it out of her again. Let's talk about it again. Like try to let her vent a little bit.
Yeah.
And my kids were pretty nonchalant about it. I think we'll see what happens with them. They are both believers, but I think they are liberalizing as we speak, as far as theologically and politically. We'll see what ends up for them. What was interesting for me, I had one family member, an aunt, who really was curious, who really asked me kind of similar questions that you're asking me. But mostly everyone else, and this is, I think, another common experience for deconverts, is that no one ever asks why. Nobody really wants to hear.
Really?
Yeah, nobody really wants to engage in what happened. Why do you think this now? But it's really like, let's just not talk about it and pretend that it doesn't exist. So that's been my experience with my family. They've all been wonderful, and my friends as well. I'm like, I'd say I'm 95% of the way out. There's a handful of Bible college friends who I haven't had the opportunity to tell yet. But everyone has, nobody has said, "Oh, you're going to hell. I'm not talking to you anymore." They've all been, I disagree with you, Dave, but I love you, and we're still friends.
Okay. Well, so not as traumatic as it could have been in some contexts.
Yes, absolutely. And again,
obviously I'm playing it down a bit here, because I'm sure, especially with your wife, it must have been more traumatic than you're going to share on air.
No, and that's something I want to acknowledge is, and again, a purpose for the podcast is a lot of people have much, much worse experiences. Like I happen to live in a relatively liberal area. There's, I'm not in the middle of the Bible Belt of the United States. You know what I mean? Like a number of things went my way. I was briefly in the ministry many years ago, a couple of decades ago. I had long since had a career in technology, so I didn't have financial concerns. So what I'm trying to convey to you, David, is that I had it relatively easy, and I'm painfully aware of that. And there are a number of people who are not as lucky. They experience the loss of family and friends and community. And potentially their way of life, their way of making a living. So there can be very dramatic experiences for it.
Yeah. Have you come across any? I can't remember what they call themselves now. Unbelieving pastors. Because apparently there's a whole anonymous online community of ministers that have lost their faith but are still in ministry, because that's all they've trained to do. They would lose their livelihood. They would, if they kind of came out as unbelievers, it would just ruin not just the church but their life.
Right.
Have you come across that community at all then?
Yeah, the community is called the Clergy Project, and there are a number of people that are involved in that are really significant thinkers, and they put together that community, and I think it's really helped a number of people. Now, I don't know personally any of those people, but again, I mentioned earlier, Bart Campolo is now a secular humanist chaplain, I believe in Cincinnati now. I'm going to ruin this. Jerry DeWitt also has a podcast, and he's a part of the Clergy Project. Used to be a Pentecostal minister, is now. So, and then one of the early people that I listened to was the Life After God podcast with Ryan Bell, and he was a Seventh-day Adventist minister who then became a secular humanist as well. So again, I don't know these people personally. I've interacted with them a few times on Twitter, but they are the public face.
Because most of these
Clergy Project, yeah.
Because as far as I understood, it's kind of for ministers that are still in ministry, so they can't come out as atheists because.
That's correct. Yeah. And I do not know anyone personally who is.
Oh, okay.
Currently.
No, I just wondered because obviously as a minister.
Yeah.
That must be such a terrible place to be in.
I can only imagine. Yeah. I talk about my experience when I went to Bible college. I feel like they did too good a job in that. Wow. I was taught critical thinking. I was taught. We mentioned earlier about exegesis, hermeneutics. Of really absorbing the Bible as who were the original authors, who were the original readers, what was the cultural context at the time. All of those things. And there was a level of intellectual freedom at Bible college that I thought was wonderful, and I was unaware of it, right? And then as soon as I was done, I had my degree in hand, and I went to my particular denomination to get the first step towards ordination. It's called certification. There was this laundry list of statements that I had to sign off on and literally say, I will defend these, I will preach these from the pulpit, I believe these things. And to my shame, then and today, I did sign that, and that was not 100% truthful.
So. Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever. Yeah. I can't quite imagine being in that situation where you kind of have to agree to something that you don't agree with internally. But I mean, obviously, being in the situation that I'm in as a pastor, should I start having these serious doubts, if you like, I mean, not just the ones that kind of fly into your head and then they fly out again after a while, I mean, kind of serious questioning and kind of, I don't know what I would do, because again, I mean, the wife, obviously she's a Christian.
Yeah.
I'm employed by a church. I don't have any other skills.
Yeah.
That I'm aware of. I mean, I'm good at languages, but that doesn't normally bring home the bacon in any sense or shape.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously it would be difficult should I find myself in that situation. You would have to extricate yourself very slowly. You couldn't just stand up in the pulpit one Sunday and say, actually, I don't believe in this rubbish anymore, and walk off. I mean, you couldn't, especially as we live in a house that belongs to the church.
Right.
So kind of, I would be both unemployed and homeless if I did that. I mean, I'm not, in case any of your listeners are kind of wondering if I'm trying to make a sort of covert confession here, I'm not in any way near that position. I'm currently firmly convinced of the truth of the gospel that I'm preaching. So this is a hypothetical question, but it has run through my mind. When I read about it.
What I would say for any of our listeners who might be in that position, the Clergy Project is the first place I would recommend going. And what they do is a very quick, first of all, anonymity is one of their highest priorities. They give you a quick, somebody will call you and talk with you to make sure that you're not just trying to come in to yell fire and brimstone at other people.
What of that? Undercover evangelist.
Exactly. And then, my understanding, and again, I'm not personally a member of this, but my understanding is that that person would have an opportunity to talk to other people who have gone through very similar experiences. There's a community there. There's this, a sense of support system that people need, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one other question I had is, what do you wish the Christian pastors and leaders knew about people like yourself that have deconverted? I mean, in a way, we've already touched on a number of those things, kind of like, don't use stupid arguments or kind of quote the Bible at you. But is there anything that you feel most pastors, most ministers just don't get this about us, and you wish we did?
Yes, and I don't think that this applies to you, but most pastors. That is that even I was amazed that after I finally admitted to myself, I no longer believe, and I can no longer call myself a Christian. How both, some things changed, but how little changed. I am still the same person, and really a tremendous amount of my morality, my sense of purpose in life, my sense, a number of things just remained constant through that process.
You didn't become any moral monster then.
Exactly. I am the most boring person that you've ever met, David. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I'm faithful to my wife. I'm just pretty boring. And that was consistent before and after. And I think there's definitely this assumption that, as soon as someone is without God, that they, particularly from a moral perspective, that they just let loose and it's a sin. Right. And that I don't find that to be true for the people that I've met who have gone through the same experience. And for certain, that's not my experience. And even from, I mentioned the kind of sense of purpose. What I discovered was that I was really a religious humanist while I was a believer. And what I mean by that is my focus on grace was about people. I love people, and I wanted to show the love of God to people and to have people love each other. And what I am now is a secular humanist, and I think it's that horizontal grace, that connection between human beings that provides the meaning in life. And I think that our relationships with family and friends and the communities that we participate in are what our purpose is, are what our meaning in life is. And in other words, it just barely changed, just the kind of direct direction.
I mean, and the thing is, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I would, as you obviously understand, would add the horizontal, the vertical relationship as well. Kind of, we're made to love God and love our neighbor.
Right.
And sadly, again, it seems like a lot of Christians, well, I don't know about a lot, but a number of prominent ones, so once they get the limelight, kind of go all out for love the Lord, and they forget about loving the neighbors.
Yes.
And I do struggle with that, because Jesus said both. And it's kind of in John's first epistle, he says, how can you love God if you don't love your brother?
Right.
And that is something that sadly seems to have kind of gone a lot of people by without them even noticing. It's kind of, as long as you profess to love God, you can do anything you like to as a human being. That's one of those cases I would say, well, that isn't genuine Christianity. And I know that you kind of talk about that on your blog, and I kind of agree with it as well. This sort of trying to cop out by saying, but you should look at my version of Christianity. I represent the true Christianity, and everybody else is wrong. And 99% misunderstood the gospel, and I'm the one who got it. I understand why atheists laugh at that argument, because I mean, especially when you narrow it down to kind of like the Westboro Baptists do, for example, it's just our church and hardly that. But there are some things where I would say actually that is not compatible with any form of Christianity. I mean, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. You can't get away from the fact that Jesus himself said that.
Right.
So,
I completely agree.
Christianity that kind of misses out on loving your neighbor,
right,
has missed out on a very important aspect of Christianity, and sadly, that seems to happen a lot, and I don't understand it.
Yeah,
but there we are.
So again, I commend you. I think that is, I think there's so much of the New Testament, in particular, what brought me to Christianity to begin with, about Jesus' teachings about, that he came for the sick and not for the well, and that.
It goes on to point out that actually everybody is sick.
Yeah, I understand that perspective. Yeah. I appreciate that.
I had to get it in case there were listeners who didn't.
And I also find it ironic that much of Jesus's teachings is about the hypocrisy of the strongest believers of his time, the Pharisees.
Yeah, I know.
And he called them whitewashed tombs. And I feel like my faith tradition, my former faith tradition, is the modern day Pharisee. And
unfortunately, I mean, somebody pointed out that evangelicals, in the more theological sense, not well, including the American political sense, but on this side of the pond as well, are very close to the Pharisees in many ways. And the Pharisees were the good guys, they were the religious guys, and they were the guys who got it all wrong.
Right.
We wanted to stand up and defend God against the Messiah.
Yeah.
And yeah, we are still in danger of doing that sometimes. And I'm sure I'd get some flack from some people at church if they heard me say, well, I have said things like that, actually.
Yeah.
And
well,
they are quite bored. I'm young, I'm well, in this village, I'm still young.
Yes. And to be fair, I think that the atheist community is just as guilty of doing very similar things. I think atheists say very, very stupid things to believers and behave.
Well, yes, it's quite easy to find that on Twitter.
And behave poorly. And one of my, since you've already seen the blog, but one of my posts is about why I don't consider myself an anti-theist. And the gist of that is that although, and I don't want to water down, we disagree about metaphysics here, but I hold nothing against believers. I was one. I don't think it's about intelligence or cleverness. I'm still the same level of intelligence that I am now, right? I can't, how could I believe that, right? I don't, so I understand what it's like to be a believer, and so I couldn't possibly be angry or hostile towards believers. And so one of my goals, the reason for the pseudonym Graceful Atheist, is try to be honest, to be vulnerable, to connect with people of whichever faith or not faith, and make those human connections, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you can only learn from listening to each other, and I think kind of when you have two corners shouting at each other and not listening, you're not going to get very far, unfortunately.
Sure.
And that's kind of what, when you said about having this podcast, and I thought, yeah, that sounds quite interesting. Because, I mean, as I said, I started following you and Herman Mehta and a couple of other atheists and kind of people that I disagree with on various things. For that very reason, to listen to other voices, get out of the echo chamber a bit. And on that note as well, if I look up to my bookcase, which you can't see, but because it's kind of outside of reach of the camera, obviously, I've got Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris. One of each, which isn't much, obviously. I got another Richard Dawkins book at home as well, but this is my office. So there's only one of the four horsemen that I haven't read anything by yet. So, I mean, just to point out that just like you kind of read Christian apologetics and things, I have also read some of the big atheist apologetics, if you like, and definitely found Sam Harris the best, or the best articulated, with the best arguments of the three. I haven't read Understand It, so I can't include him yet. But
well, that's a good thing.
It's important that whether we read each other's books as it were, kind of to know what the other side is thinking and what are the arguments. I mean, from my point of view, partly so that I can work out better ways of answering them, obviously, but also just to see what is it in my tradition, my faith, that these people object so strongly to help me kind of think better about, just how I minister, how I interact with people. The more more human beings that you come across, and the more different views you come across, the better you'll understand yourself as well.
Right.
Hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do want to segue there. I want to be cognizant of our time here. And I wanted to ask just a couple of questions to try to wrap this up just a little bit. And again, these are not meant to be gotcha questions, but and really they're more in reference to what you think about me or atheists. So granting at the beginning that you believe that I'm mistaken or wrong. So granting that, do you believe that I was a real Christian when I was a believer?
Well, yes, I have no reason to assume that you weren't. I mean, we touched on that at the beginning as well. That's kind of what triggered the whole conversation. And I've people in my own family that have gone through that similar transition, if you like, to deconversion. So, I think it's very arrogant and downright rude to suggest that you don't know whether you were a believer or not. kind of you think you were, but I can say that you weren't. I mean, that's just rude.
Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. And again, David, I think what you need to understand is that you might be one of the minority, right? Not everyone would feel that way, and so
I'll ask people in my church, some of the more mature Christians and people that do interact, the ones with strong bent for evangelism, see what they think. Because it'd be interesting to know if this is a kind of US versus Europe divide. If
that's possible.
More people in America would have that approach, or if it's a Calvinist thing versus non-Calvinist Arminian. I don't know. I'll ask a few people because it's an interesting question.
Sure. Okay, great. Along the same lines, I think we're going to go over similar territory here, but do you believe that since my deconversion that I am incapable of being a moral person?
No, I don't subscribe to this idea that you have to be religious in order to be moral. The argument that I could go along with is you don't have an objective basis necessarily for being a moral person.
Okay.
And you would be more, you could be more susceptible to changing your morals if you saw fit because you don't have an objective standard. Having said that, that seems to come quite easily to a number of Christians as well. So it's not a very strong argument. So no, again, a lot of non-believers seem to share my ethics in a way that a lot of Christians don't seem to. Again, cultural differences maybe, I don't know, but no.
I found a tweet of yours where someone was saying, what are some of the arguments that we should retire? And you were saying that the argument that if there is a God, life has no meaning. If there is no God, life has no meaning. That may be true, but it doesn't prove anything either way. And the same goes for if there is no God, there is no morality. Possibly true, but not evidence in any way. Again, David, I appreciate your honesty.
I got some people objecting to that as well.
Yeah, I bet you did.
I'm not sure if they didn't understand what I said or if they just disagreed. But there was kind of interest because I've always thought that is a stupid argument because saying it, if there is no God, there is no morality. Well, yes, but if there is no God, there is no God. That's not evidence or proof in any way because, just because you wish for there to be objective morality doesn't mean that God has to exist. So it's a flawed argument. So we're singing from the same hymn sheet there, I think.
Yes. Last couple questions. Do you take me at my word when I say that I truly believe, or I should say that I do not believe that God exists? It's not that I think that he exists and I'm angry at him or that I'm against him.
Yeah, I did already touch on that, the Romans 1 argument that deep down all atheists do believe that God exists. They just kind of refuse to acknowledge him. No, I don't buy that argument. If you say, if you're convinced, and again, this might be one of these things. I grew up surrounded by non-believers because in Sweden, the vast majority of people are non-Christians. My mom is a non-Christian. My dad was a non-Christian until I was about 6. My sister, my half-brother and half-sister are non-Christians. For most of my time at school, I was the only Christian in my class. There might have been others in the same year, but not in my class. I think there was once when I was 12, there was another boy that was also a Christian, and I thought it was quite exciting. There's 2 of us.
Right.
And this is a very different situation from what most Americans would be familiar with, I think. So from that point of view, it's much easier for me to accept that, yes, of course, if somebody isn't a Christian, they're not a Christian. They don't believe. They assume that God doesn't exist. I have no reason to assume that they are being dishonest to themselves. Again, it's a stupid argument.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, and the last one is the hard one. I want you to be honest. I'm not looking. You don't need to be nice to me. I want you to be honest. Do you believe that because I have rejected the gospel of Jesus, that I am going to hell?
Probably would be my answer to that. But as I said when we talked about this earlier, I'm not going to be categorical on that. God's grace is greater than we can imagine, because I'm also very much a grace person. And if you kind of take legalism as one ditch and antinomianism the lawlessness as the other ditch, I've always sailed much closer to antinomianism. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very much opposed to any form of legalism. And so God's grace is much greater than we realize. Anyone who wants to be with Jesus will be with Jesus. I don't know your heart. God knows your heart. If C.S. Lewis's vision of how it works is anywhere near true, it may well be there will be people who arrive in eternity having denied Jesus, but getting there and realizing that actually they would rather be with Jesus, even if it means having to acknowledge their sins and their faults and their mistakes. I'm not going to rule that out.
Okay.
I'm not going to make you any promises either, because
I wouldn't take
it's not in my hands anyway.
Yes.
All I can say is that the only sure promise you have is that if you do believe and repent, then you can be sure that you're not going to hell. What happens to the rest is in God's hands.
Fair enough. Well, you got to tell the gospel there, and David, I just really appreciate your honesty, and it's clear that you have a tender heart, that you're one of the Christians who I would have admired, and I do admire you. Again, that isn't always the case. I think you represent the best of Christianity, and I hope you all the success. Thank you so much.
Well, it was nice chatting.
Some final thoughts on the episode. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Reverend David Hellsten as much as I did. I think you can hear David's genuineness, his honesty, and his deep pastoral heart for people. Actually, I think that David exemplifies what I recognize as religious humanism in his care for people. You can also hear our excitement talking to one another. I apologize for the few times we cut each other off, but it was out of the joy of conversation. I could not have asked for a better person for the first A Believer Interviews the Graceful Atheist episode. I want to thank David for coming on the podcast. It was brave of him to risk jumping in before we really knew each other well. I hope I have done him justice. He truly met me in an honesty contest, and for that he has my heartfelt respect. In our email exchanges since then, we have both expressed interest in doing at least one more episode, so please look for that in the feed in the coming weeks. One more thing I'd like to highlight is, in our conversation, I bring up the Clergy Project. The Clergy Project is a fantastic organization that helps former and current religious professionals. So if you were a minister, a pastor, a missionary, and you find yourself on the other side of deconversion, you no longer believe, and the unique challenges that entails, please contact the Clergy Project. I will have a link in the show notes. And once again, I want to invite you, if you are a believer and you have hard questions for me, and you want to meet me in an honesty contest, please contact me. Email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com or @gracefulatheist on Twitter. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Makaih Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast's audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me @gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.